The library basement smelled of paper so old it seemed to sigh with every breath of air. Dust motes hung suspended in the pale light from a flickering bulb, and the silence was so deep that even the faint creak of a floorboard seemed intrusive. Miriam Ellery, the quiet archivist whose name was barely known outside these walls, had made this dim labyrinth her second home. Day after day she catalogued forgotten donations, repaired cracked bindings, and arranged stacks no one else dared to touch. It was on one such afternoon, while shifting a collection of water-damaged maritime logs, that her fingers brushed something unexpected. A narrow cedar chest, wedged between a toppled stack of crates. The lock was so corroded, it crumbled at her touch. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a single scroll, bound with a crimson cord hardened with age. The parchment was brittle, the surface bearing faint traces of gilt. But what froze her in place was the seal, an emblem she'd only seen once before, buried in the footnotes of an obscure 17th-century text, 2 concentric circles encasing a trident, each point tipped with a different gemstone. Her breath caught. This was not an ordinary find. For several minutes, she didn't move. The weight of the moment pressed on her chest, as if disturbing the scroll might wake something long dormant. She could feel a strange warmth emanating from it, absurdly out of place in the cold basement air. A part of her wanted to rush upstairs and show someone, anyone, but she knew better. She'd worked here long enough to know that treasures, once announced, had a way of slipping into someone else's hands. Miriam sat cross-legged on the floor, pulling her magnifying lens from her apron pocket. The seal's design was delicate, yet deliberate. The trident's central prong had a faint engraving along its shaft, symbols she could not immediately decipher, but which stirred a gnawing sense of recognition. Somewhere deep in her mind, a memory surfaced, a lecture she'd once overheard, in which a scholar scoffed at an amateur's claim that Atlantis had left physical records. "Atlantis," the scholar had said with a derisive smile, "belongs to poets, not archaeologists." But what if they were wrong? Her fingers itched to untie the cord. She knew the risks. Old parchment could disintegrate with one careless movement. Yet her heart drummed with the knowledge that this moment might never come again. She took a deep breath, slid her letter opener under the hardened knot, and with a careful twist the cord fell away. The scroll resisted at first, then unrolled in a slow whisper of fibers, stretching after centuries of silence. Lines of script filled the surface, not in Latin, Greek, or any language she'd encountered in her training. The letters were fluid yet geometric, curling into themselves like waves folding onto a shore. Along the margins, faint ink sketches depicted intricate buildings that seemed both alien and strangely familiar. Grand towers rising from circular harbours, canals crisscrossing wide avenues, and a central plaza dominated by a towering spire. She felt the air in the room shift. The world outside the basement seemed impossibly far away, irrelevant in the face of what she held. The longer she looked, the more certain she became. This was not a map to any city that had ever been recorded in known history. Her fingertips tingled. The whispers of every dismissed myth, every scoffed-at legend seemed to gather around her. Atlantis. The word hovered in her mind like a forbidden prayer. Miriam swallowed hard. She would not tell anyone. Not yet. This would be her secret until she knew exactly what it meant, and whether the world was ready to hear it. If you're enjoying this story of justice and hidden strength, Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of prejudice turned into the most valuable lesson of Dr. Holdren's life. With the cord and seal now lying on the floor, and the strange language burning in her vision, she rose to her feet. Upstairs, life would continue as usual. Patrons whispering, the head librarian sipping tea, the clock ticking toward closing. But down here, something had shifted. History had whispered her name, and she had answered. The following morning, Miriam arrived earlier than usual, the echo of her own footsteps following her down the marble hall. She hadn't slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, the strange script from the scroll seemed to swim before her, looping and curling until it dissolved into the shadowy outline of a city swallowed by waves. She locked the basement door behind her, drawing the heavy bolt across. The scroll lay where she had left it, cushioned between sheets of acid-free tissue paper. She placed it gently on the long oak work table and adjusted the angle of the lamp. The symbols were unlike anything she had ever studied. They weren't pictographs in the Egyptian sense, nor did they carry the rigid symmetry of cuneiform. There was rhythm in them, a kind of visual cadence that suggested both precision and poetry. Her fingers traced a series of repeated motifs, 3 spirals interlocked, a zigzag line, then a pattern of concentric squares. She reached for her reference shelf, pulling down dictionaries of dead languages, archaeological reports, even speculative treatises that the academic world had largely discarded. One book in particular caught her eye, The Myths Beneath the Waves by Dr. Roland Holdren, a work that had been all but laughed out of publication for its claim that a pre-classical maritime civilization had encoded its history in a proto-script unknown to modern linguistics. As her eyes scanned the pages, her pulse quickened. Holdren's crude sketches bore striking resemblance to the patterns on the scroll. He'd linked the spirals to water deities and the concentric squares to fortified harbours. Miriam ran her fingertip along a margin note Holdren had scrawled. "When you find the trident seal, you'll have found the key." Her heart pounded. She knew what this meant. The seal on the scroll was no mere ornament. It was the cipher. The trident's engravings, those barely there lines she had seen under magnification, could be the phonetic or symbolic anchors for the entire language. She set to work sketching each trident marking onto tracing paper. Hours passed unnoticed. Light shifted from the cool blue of morning to the soft gold of late afternoon. Piece by piece, fragments began to make sense. Words, or what she believed to be words, emerged. Great Flood, 7 Rings, Isle of Pillars. A shiver ran down her spine. Miriam leaned back, rubbing her tired eyes. She knew the academic world would never take her at her word, not without definitive proof. The scroll, if genuine, could rewrite human history, and that was precisely why so many would try to bury it. She had seen it happen before with smaller discoveries, artifacts reclassified, lost to private collections, their implications erased. A knock startled her. It was Ruth, the head librarian, her silver hair catching the dim light. "You've been locked in here all day," Ruth said gently. "What is it you're working on?" Miriam hesitated, her mind racing. Should she trust her? Or would Ruth, even with her kind smile, feel the pressure to hand the scroll over to some official authority? "It's an old maritime log," Miriam lied. "Foreign script. Fascinating, but tedious." Ruth chuckled, apparently satisfied. "Only you could find fascinating and tedious in the same sentence. Don't forget, we close in an hour." When the door clicked shut, Miriam exhaled in relief. She couldn't risk anyone else seeing it. Not yet. She needed time. And yet, a gnawing thought crept in as she packed up her notes for the night. If the script spoke truth, If these phrases were genuine history and not elaborate fiction, then she wasn't merely deciphering words. She was decoding the death certificate of an entire civilization. The question wasn't whether she could understand it, it was whether she should. 3 days later, the breakthrough came not from the text itself, but from a thin crease in the parchment. Miriam had been tracing the symbols along the bottom edge when she felt the slightest irregularity beneath her fingertips, a ridge that didn't belong. Her pulse quickened. With the gentlest pressure, she teased apart a narrow fold no wider than her thumbnail, revealing something she had not expected. A second layer of parchment, sealed within the first. She fetched her scalpel, the same one she used for delicate restoration work, and began the painstaking task of separating the layers. Each slice of the blade was a breath held, each movement a gamble between revelation and ruin. When at last the layers came apart, a fragment of cloth fell onto the table, woven from a strange silvery fibre that caught the light like water in motion. It wasn't just decoration. Inked onto the cloth was a map. Not a map in the modern sense. There were no political borders, no familiar continents. Instead, vast land masses sprawled across an unfamiliar configuration of the Earth. In the center, dominating the composition, was a ringed island encircled by 3 massive harbors with causeways stretching toward the open sea. The lines were impossibly precise for an artifact of such age. Depth markings rippled outward from the island, suggesting careful knowledge of currents and undersea contours. Miriam felt the hair rise on her arms. She had seen something like this before, in an article about bathymetric mapping, the kind used by marine geologists today. But this was centuries, no, millennia, too old to exist. At the bottom corner of the cloth, the trident seal appeared again. This time flanked by a phrase she had partially deciphered, "Before the sea reclaimed us." Her mind raced. If this was authentic, it meant the scroll was more than a written account. It was a survivor's record, a precise guide to the world before an epochal flood. But there was more. Turning the cloth over, she noticed faint ink bleeding through from the other side. She adjusted her lamp, angling the light until the shapes resolved. It was a list, rows of symbols paired with what could only be numbers. A catalogue? A ledger? The thought that it might be a record of ships, supplies, or even names of survivors made her hands tremble. The gravity of it was suffocating. She wasn't simply handling a relic, she was holding the memory of a lost world. She rose and crossed the room to the globe in the corner, spinning it slowly. Her eyes darted between the familiar geography and the alien configuration on the cloth. Even with continental drift, the coordinates, if that's what they were, pointed to a location far out in the Atlantic, beyond the Azores, in a stretch of ocean that modern charts marked as nothing but deep water. Her heart hammered as the possibility solidified. This was the Isle of Pillars the text had mentioned, and if the scroll's makers had left such detailed instructions, perhaps they had intended for someone to find it. That night, Miriam didn't go home. She spread her notes, sketches and translations across the work table, stringing them together like a detective assembling the final pieces of a case. The picture that emerged was staggering. A thriving maritime power, concentric harbours feeding into a fortified city. An advanced understanding of engineering, astronomy and ocean currents, and then disaster. A flood so vast it erased them from the surface of the earth. By dawn, the decision was made. She could no longer keep this to herself, not if it was real. But she also knew that if she went to the wrong people, it would vanish into some locked vault. She needed allies. The kind who wouldn't laugh her out of the room. The kind who might risk their reputations to follow the trail. As the first light of morning crept into the basement, Miriam traced her finger over the map's harbours one last time. She whispered the name she hadn't dared to speak aloud until now. Atlantis. The call to Dr. Roland Holdren was the hardest step Miriam had taken in years. His reputation was tarnished. His career reduced to speaking at fringe conferences and writing for journals that mainstream archaeologists wouldn't cite. But if anyone could understand the script and the map, it was him. She found his number buried in the acknowledgements section of one of his books. Her hand shook slightly as she dialed, half expecting a disconnected line. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was deep, cautious, and weary. "Dr. Holdren, my name is Miriam Ellery. I'm an archivist. I believe I've found something that matches your work on proto-scripts and maritime civilizations." A pause. "Miss Ellery, do you have any idea how many times I've heard that?" His tone was almost mocking, but beneath it she detected a flicker of interest. "I have the trident seal." Silence. Then, sharper. "Describe it." She did, detailing the concentric circles, the gemstones on each prong, the faint engravings. When she finished, the line stayed quiet long enough for her to think he'd hung up. "Where are you?" he asked finally. 2 days later, he was standing in the library basement, tall and broad-shouldered, his once dark hair now streaked with grey. His eyes scanned the scroll with a kind of reverence Miriam had not seen in anyone else. "This is—" He trailed off, glancing at her as though afraid to give voice to his thoughts. "I was told this was a fantasy, even when I had fragments of proof in my own hands. Where did you find it?" She hesitated. "A sealed chest. In the back archives." Holdren traced the lines of script with a fingertip, his eyes narrowing in concentration. "This confirms my hypothesis about the spiral triplets. It's a water-based numeral system. See here? Depth measurements, harbour entries." Miriam leaned closer. "And the map?" Holdren unfolded the silvery cloth, his face hardening. "This is a bathymetric survey. Whoever made this understood the seabed in a way we only replicated in the last century. And these coordinates—" He stopped, turning to her. "Have you compared them to modern charts?" She nodded. "They align with an area in the Atlantic. Nothing there now, just deep ocean." "That's what they'd have you think," he murmured. "You realize what will happen if we announce this. They'll destroy us both. Or worse, they'll take it, hide it, and pretend it never existed." His words mirrored her own fears. Still, Miriam felt a stubborn fire rise in her chest. "Then we don't announce it. We follow it." Holdren's eyes sharpened. "You mean, go there?" "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "If the scroll is right, if those harbours and structures still exist under the waves, we have to see them with our own eyes. Evidence they can't ignore." He studied her for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "I have contacts, people who owe me favours. We'll need a vessel, sonar equipment, diving gear, permits." "Permits?" Miriam raised an eyebrow. Holdren smirked faintly. "Or perhaps just a willingness to take the long way around bureaucracy." The weeks that followed were a blur. Late-night calls to distant ports, hushed meetings in cramped cafes, coded emails sent from untraceable accounts. Each step felt like a point of no return. Miriam kept the scroll and the cloth hidden in a climate-controlled box in her flat, leaving the library archives untouched for the first time in years. But with every plan they made, every resource they secured, a tension began to creep in. Sometimes she thought she saw shadows lingering too long across the street from her apartment. Once, she came home to find her desk drawers slightly ajar. It seemed someone else had heard the whispers of Atlantis, and they wanted it too. The first attack came not with fists or bullets, but with words. A week before their planned departure, an anonymous email landed in Miriam's inbox. It contained a single line. "Atlantis is a grave. Don't dig it up." No signature. No traceable sender. She forwarded it to Holdren, who responded within minutes. "Ignore it. If they knew what we had, they wouldn't waste time warning us." But the warning gnawed at her. Every time she touched the scroll, she wondered if the message had been a threat or something else. 2 days later, they met at the Maritime Research Centre to present a fabricated project proposal, a cover story about subsurface geological mapping that would get them access to certain equipment without revealing their real target. The meeting was almost over when the door opened and a tall, thin man in a charcoal suit walked in uninvited. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes flicked over Miriam with unsettling precision. "Dr. Holdren," he said smoothly, "I see you've found a new assistant." "Mr. Kell," Holdren replied, his voice clipped. "We're in the middle of something." "I'm aware." Kell's gaze moved to the rolled chart on the table. "Still chasing fairy tales?" "Only the ones worth catching," Holdren said. Kell smiled faintly, then turned to Miriam. "Be careful what you let him drag you into. Some stories end with the storyteller buried alongside their subject." After Kell left, Miriam's voice was low and tight. "Who was that?" "Government liaison. Used to be a friend. Now he's the kind of man who files reports you never see until they ruin your life." The tension doubled. When word got out that their supposed geological mapping had been approved for a short expedition, the academic community erupted. Scholars who hadn't spoken to Holdren in years suddenly resurfaced, some mocking, some demanding details, others accusing him of chasing nonsense. One particularly sharp email came from Dr. Eliza Carr, a maritime historian who had publicly debated Holdren years earlier. "If this is another Atlantis stunt, I'll make sure you never work in this field again," she wrote. The ridicule might have shaken Miriam once, but now it only solidified her resolve. She'd seen the script, the map, the coordinates. They were real. But just as she began to feel steadier, a letter arrived at her flat, handwritten, no return address. Inside was a single photograph. The scroll, unrolled on her work table. The angle was from above, as though the photographer had been standing right behind her. Her hands went cold. She tore through the flat, searching for any sign of intrusion. Nothing was missing, but the message was clear. Someone could come and go as they pleased. She called Holdren immediately. "We have to move faster," she said. By the time they met at the docks that night, the decision was made. They would leave ahead of schedule quietly, without alerting anyone, not even the crew they'd originally planned to hire. Holdren's contact had secured a smaller vessel, enough to carry the two of them and a skeleton crew of trusted hands. As they loaded the crates, Miriam glanced back toward the distant glow of the city. Somewhere in that sprawl of lights, someone was watching, waiting for them to make a mistake. She touched the hidden pocket inside her jacket, feeling the familiar texture of the silvery cloth map. No matter what happened out there, she would keep it close, because if they were right, and the scroll led them to what they thought it did, every person trying to stop them was about to learn that Atlantis wasn't just a legend. It was a secret too big to stay buried. The ocean had a way of swallowing time. Days bled into one another beneath an endless sky, the hum of the ship's engines a constant heartbeat in the background. Miriam stood at the bow most mornings, the salty wind cutting through her jacket, eyes fixed on the horizon, as though the waves themselves might part to reveal the truth. The Aquila was small but sturdy, an aging research vessel retrofitted with sonar arrays, deep-water winches, and diving platforms. The crew numbered only 4 besides Miriam and Holdren, each man sworn to silence with contracts and cash in hand. Even so, Miriam noticed the way they sometimes glanced at her when they thought she wasn't looking. Curiosity mixed with the suspicion that they were heading into something far stranger than geological mapping. On the 5th day at sea, the sonar tech, a wiry man named Delgado, called them to the control room. "You're going to want to see this," he said, tapping the monitor. The screen displayed the seabed in shades of green and blue, smooth contours of sand and rock giving way to a jagged rise. But this was no natural formation. The lines were too straight, the angles too precise. "That's a wall," Holdren breathed. "More than a wall," Delgado replied, zooming in. "That's a perimeter, circular, almost 2 kilometers across." Miriam felt her pulse thunder in her ears, the map's concentric rings. Here they were, etched into the ocean floor. They adjusted course, following the sonar's readouts until the circular formation gave way to what looked like a series of radial avenues, each terminating in larger, rectangular shapes. "Harbour entrances," Holdren said. "They match exactly." The crew grew quiet. Whatever doubts they'd carried aboard were dissolving under the weight of what they saw. That night, over mugs of bitter coffee, they planned the first dive. The depth would be punishing, over 300 meters, but Holdren's contacts had secured experimental atmospheric dive suits capable of withstanding the pressure. As Miriam examined her suit, the weight of what they were doing pressed down on her. It wasn't just about discovery anymore, it was about preservation. Every artifact down there would be a target for governments, corporations, and private collectors. One wrong move, and the city could be stripped bare before its story was told. The next morning dawned grey and still. Miriam and Holdren climbed into the suits, each movement deliberate in the cramped space. Delgado gave a thumbs up from the control deck as the crane lowered them into the water. At first, there was only darkness and the hiss of oxygen in her ears. Then, slowly, the floodlights on their helmets pierced the black, revealing shadows that resolved into structures. Her breath caught. Columns rose from the seabed, encrusted with coral but unmistakably carved. Stone steps led to open plazas where the sand had long since claimed the spaces between. Murals, faded but still rich in colour, depicted ships, marketplaces, and towering spires that mirrored the scroll's sketches. "Miriam," Holdren's voice crackled in her earpiece. "Do you see the central spire?" She turned, and there it was, rising from the heart of the city, a tower of pale stone, its upper reaches shattered but its base intact, engraved with spirals and tridents. The silence between them spoke louder than words. They had found it. A flicker of movement caught her eye, something darting between the columns. Her first thought was a fish, but the shape was too quick, too deliberate. She turned her helmet, scanning the shadows, but it was gone. "We should get samples," Holdren said, breaking the moment. "Stone fragments, sediment, anything we can date." As they began to work, Miriam felt it again, that eerie sense of being watched. The sea pressed in around them, vast and unknowable, and she wondered if perhaps Kell's warning hadn't been a threat at all, but a promise. They returned to the Aquila with 3 sealed sample cases and the kind of silence that made the crew restless. No one wanted to be the first to speak, to shatter the electric tension that clung to them like salt on skin. Back in the ship's small lab, Holdren laid out the artifacts on a foam-lined table. There were 2 chunks of carved stone from the central spire, each engraved with the interlocking spirals Miriam had traced from the scroll. The third case held a bronze disc about the size of a dinner plate, its surface etched with markings so fine they could only be read under magnification. "This isn't a coin," Holdren murmured, adjusting the microscope. "It's a navigational device. See the concentric dials? They chart celestial positions." Miriam leaned over his shoulder. "And these outer etchings, those are tidal cycles." They exchanged a glance that said everything. This civilization had mapped the stars and the seas with a precision that rivaled modern technology. That night they dove again, this time venturing deeper into the concentric harbours. Schools of fish scattered as their lights passed over toppled statues and collapsed archways. It was as if the sea had frozen the city mid-breath, preserving its final moment before silence took hold. Miriam's beam caught something glinting inside a half-buried structure. She pushed closer, brushing away the silt with her gloved hand. It was another seal, identical to the one that had bound the scroll, but this one set into a stone slab. She called Holdren over. Together, they pried the slab free, revealing a chamber beneath. Inside, a long table of white stone stretched across the room, covered in objects still intact, amphorae, tools, fragments of parchment sealed in glass-like resin. And at the center, a tall, narrow chest. Miriam's breath fogged the inside of her helmet. "Do we open it here?" "Not underwater," Holdren replied. "It could disintegrate." "We bring it up." The crane hauled the chest aboard under the crew's watchful eyes. By the time they pried it open in the lab, the air was thick with anticipation. Inside were rows of thin stone tablets, each covered in the same flowing script as the scroll. But these were different, organized, deliberate, as if they were meant to be read in sequence. Holdren's voice was low, reverent. "This is a library." As Miriam ran her gloved fingers over the first tablet, she felt the enormity of it. These weren't just remnants of a lost city. They were the voices of its people, speaking across millennia. Before they could begin translating, Delgado burst in. "We've got company!" On the radar, a fast-moving vessel was closing in from the east. No markings, no calls on the radio. Holdren's jaw tightened. They know. Miriam's mind flashed to the photograph left in her flat, to Kell's cold smile, to the anonymous warning, "Atlantis is a grave, don't dig it up." She closed the chest, snapping the locks shut. "If they come aboard, they can't find these." The crew scrambled, hiding the tablets and artifacts in a concealed storage compartment beneath the lab floor. Above them, the hum of the approaching ship grew louder, the steady thump of its engines resonating through the hull. Miriam glanced out the porthole, her reflection wavering in the dark water beyond. For the first time since opening the scroll, she wondered if they had gone too far. But the thought lasted only a moment. Whatever was coming for them, they had already touched the truth, and she would not let it be buried again. The unmarked vessel loomed alongside the Aquila like a shadow materializing from the sea. Its hull was painted a flat, stealthy grey, its decks devoid of identifying flags. A loudspeaker crackled. "This is a restricted maritime zone," a voice announced. "Prepare to be boarded." Holdren met Miriam's gaze. "Stall them," he murmured. "I'll make sure the tablets are secure." Two men in dark uniforms clambered aboard, their movements crisp, their eyes sweeping the deck like searchlights. They carried no visible weapons, but there was no mistaking the authority in their posture. "We're conducting an inspection," the taller one said, his gaze lingering on Miriam. "Routine." "Routine?" she repeated with a faint smile. In the middle of the Atlantic, 300 nautical miles from the nearest port. He didn't answer. Instead, he nodded to his partner, who began prowling the deck. Inside the lab, Holdren had already concealed the chest of tablets in the hidden compartment. The stone fragments and bronze disc were tucked into sealed waterproof cases and lowered into a ballast tank, disguised among the ship's mechanical guts where no casual searcher would dare poke around. The inspection was slow, deliberate. One of the men tapped on bulkheads as if listening for hollow spaces. Miriam stayed close, feigning casual conversation, masking her heartbeat's quickening pace. After an hour, the men regrouped. The taller one gave a curt nod. "You're clear. Watch your course. Currents can be unpredictable here." They left as silently as they had arrived. When the Aquila pulled away, Miriam stood at the stern, watching the grey vessel shrink into the horizon. "They weren't here by chance," she said. "Of course not," Holdren replied. "They were making sure we know they're watching." The return journey was quiet. The crew avoided unnecessary conversation, as though the weight of what they carried demanded silence. Nights were spent checking and rechecking the compartment, the ballast tank, the scrolls case. Weeks later, back on land, Miriam stood in her small apartment surrounded by the artifacts. The scroll lay open on her table, the silvery map beside it. The tablets were stacked neatly in their foam casing. She could hear the city outside. Cars, voices. The life of a world that still believed Atlantis was a fairy tale. Holdren entered, setting down a thick binder of translation notes. "It's all here," he said softly. "The rise of their empire, the flood that took it. Even the names of the last ships to escape." Miriam brushed her fingers over the carved spirals on one of the tablets. "And now?" "Now we decide how much of this the world gets to see." They both knew the truth. Once released, the discovery could never be contained. Nations would fight over the ruins. Corporations would strip them bare. Opportunists would twist the story into something unrecognizable. Yet hiding it felt like another kind of betrayal, silencing voices that had endured for thousands of years. Miriam turned to the window, watching the slow drift of clouds over the city skyline. She thought of the warning letters, the unmarked ship, the shadowy eyes that had followed them from the moment she'd untied the crimson cord. Some stories changed history, others protected it, and this one, she realized, might need to do both. In the end, she and Holdren agreed on a compromise: release fragments of the discovery, enough to prove Atlantis had been real, while keeping the exact location hidden. Let the legend remain just far enough out of reach to survive. Months later, the world was still reeling. Scholars debated, skeptics scrambled, and deep beneath the Atlantic the sunken city waited, untouched, its silent plazas still cradling the last breath of a lost civilization. Miriam kept the scroll in a locked case beside her desk. Some nights, when the world was quiet, she would unroll it, tracing the spirals, feeling the weight of every life that had once walked those harbor rings. Atlantis was no longer a myth, but its greatest secret was still hers to keep. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.